In a remote corner of Alaska, brown bears at Brooks River and Katmai National Park are currently making their final preparations for winter hibernation. At nearly the same latitude, only more than 3,000 kilometers east, polar bears wait on the shore of Hudson Bay for the return of sea ice. Unlike the brown bears, who are at their fattest point of the year, polar bears are at their skinniest. Polar bears and brown bears are closely related species, and they have a lot in common, but many aspects of their lifestyles contrast sharply. Adaptation and intelligence give these bears the chance to survive. Changes to their habitats also raise uncertainty and challenges for their future in an era of human driven habitat loss and climate change. As winter descends upon North America, we witness a tale of two ecosystems and the bears that call these places home. Hi, everyone. My name is Mike Fitz. I am the resident naturalist with Explore.org, and I'm here to explore the world of polar bears and brown bears. And to help us in that journey, I'm joined by my co-host today, Alysa McCall. She is the Director of Conservation Outreach and a staff scientist with Polar Bears International. Alysa, great to see you. How you doing?
Hey, Mike. So good to be here. I'm good. And it's always nice to kind of kick off our polar bear season with a handoff chat with you.
Yeah. So we had a busy brown bear season, and we're rolling into polar bear season right now. In fact, right before we went live for this program, there was a polar bear, I think, on one of the Tundra lodge cams. So they're moving through the area, and as I mentioned earlier, we're focusing on two bear species today. One of which is the brown bear, and that's primarily where a lot of my experience around brown bears rests. So I'll be talking a lot about them. Alysa is our polar bear expert on the program today. But brown bears and polar bears, they're two separate species. But brown bears are the species that scientists will have named Ursus arctos. They're often called grizzly bears as well. Brown and grizzly bears are the same species, however. So I just wanted to make that clear. We might use those terms interchangeably between brown and grizzly bears. And then polar bears, as I mentioned, are a separate but closely related species of bear, and their scientific name is Ursus maritimus. And we invite our audience to ask questions during the program today. So if you have questions for Alysa and I about polar bears and brown bears, please do drop those in the chat, and we'll try to answer some as we're heading along. These animals are similar to one another, but they're not the same. So during the program today, I want to consider ideas like hunger, adaptability, adaptation, and intelligence, as these ideas can help us better understand how brown and polar bears meet the challenges of their environments. With that being said, Alysa, this is your first of many polar bear focused events on Explore.org in October and November, and I'm looking forward to polar bear season. So can you reintroduce us to Polar Bears International and what's in store?
Thanks, Mike. So, Polar Bears International is the only nonprofit organization that has a sole focus on conserving wild polar bears. And we work to do that through a mix of research. We do our own research and we support other research. We also work a lot with education, which includes things like this, which is so much fun. And we work with schools across the globe. And we also are increasingly working in the policy sphere to influence good policy that's good for polar bears and people too. And you can find us throughout the year doing all sorts of stuff. There's always interesting and important polar bear work to be done. But our favorite time of year is kicking off now. For the next month or 6 weeks or even 8 weeks, we are watching the polar bears. Thanks to Explore.org's help as well. You can watch polar bears too. And we can't wait to get out there on the tundra. I am right now in my home in Whitehorse, Yukon, but I'm heading up to Churchill shortly, and we have a bunch of our team members already there setting up the season. And as you mentioned, watching polar bears, we already got to see one about 20 minutes ago. Pretty cool.
Explore.org's webcams offer us, I think, a special chance to observe bears living in these very different habitats. So we have brown bears living in habitat rich with salmon, and then the webcams in Churchill, Manitoba, offer an exploration of the Arctic tundra along the shore of Hudson Bay. And these regions harbor different habitats and climates. Yet Katmai and Churchill are located at nearly the same latitude. So as we begin our sort of comparison between these two species, let's look at where they are located relative to one another. So about the same latitude. Katmai, though, much further to the west of Churchill, and we'll look at that maybe more closely first. Katmai has plenty of tundra and glaciers at high elevations, but the region experiences a relatively temperate environment due to the warming effect of the nearby Pacific Ocean, which is to the east and south, and then to the Bering Sea to the west. And then the lowland habitats are thick with small trees and shrubs. The landscape is also rich with an interconnected system of rivers and lakes, and these create perfect habitat for sockeye salmon. In Katmai, especially the portion of the national park where Brooks River and our webcams are located, salmon are the most abundant, high-calorie food for brown bears, and this allows bears in Katmai to live at very high densities. Some of the highest densities of brown bears ever measured have been taken in Katmai National Park. Dozens of individual bears, sometimes more than 100, use the 2.4-kilometer Brooks River every year. And then the region, again, it straddles this boundary between the subarctic and the temperate maritime regions that are really kind of bordering the Pacific Ocean. Alysa, the Churchill region is also a borderland of sorts between terrestrial and marine habitats, yet its habitats are quite different than what we find in Katmai.
Right, Mike. It is, of course, right at sea level. We're right on the coast. It is flat. There's one little hump called Knight's Hill that is kind of a everyone knows that it's, oh, there's Knight's Hill. You can see it from a long ways away because it's the only hump on the landscape. It's also a mixture of habitats in a really neat way. We have marine, we have boreal, we have tundra, and in that way, it's quite a diverse ecosystem. We get lots of biologists there, tons of birders. But of course, what brings many people there is the polar bear. And polar bears are there because this region does have seasonal Arctic sea ice, and we call it the seasonal sea ice ecoregion. When you talk to polar bear biologists, we break the Arctic up into kind of four separate areas depending on ice patterns. And Hudson Bay is that seasonal sea ice ecoregion. So the ice is there all winter. The bears are gone. We have no hopes to see them on the cams usually. But then, of course, in the summer and the fall, there's no sea ice. So the bears are forced back on land. And they've adapted to do that. They've adapted to come onto land where they don't have access to much food. We will see them on the cams, especially eating grasses. They'll eat berries, they'll eat goose eggs, even geese. They'll scavenge and forage on stuff. But for polar bears, really what they want is seals. And that's what they're catching when they're out on that sea ice. Sea ice gives them access to their seal prey. We'll talk more about that later. But when they're on land, they're mostly hanging out, saving up their energy. And it's really neat to be out there on the tundra with the cams with the polar bears. As it cools down, you can kind of see more and more bears come. You see them perk up, but we do see other animals. My favorite sighting many years ago now, but we saw wolverine out there on the tundra, ran right up to a polar bear. We see foxes, so keep an eye out for that. There's hares, there's owls, there's all sorts of amazing wildlife out there. There really is a special place.
Yeah, it is. I remember when I was there several years ago, how interesting it was. And that's a habitat
Mhm.
where you have all three North American bear species, including the black bears.
Yes.
So yeah, it's a really kind of special area in a lot of different ways. And when we're looking at brown bears in Katmai, we can look at sort of like the Alaska Peninsula and find that the bears are pretty much everywhere, but they're especially concentrated in areas where there's a lot of food, areas such as salmon streams. Why and how brown bears and polar bears make a living really reflects where they can find food. It reflects their physical adaptations, their behavioral adaptability, and their kind of intelligence for using the landscape. At least polar bears aren't necessarily visiting the Churchill region for food. You kind of touched on this just a moment ago. They're really waiting for that colder weather to give them the habitat they need to find food.
Absolutely. And where Churchill is located in Hudson Bay, it's kind of on almost like a shelf of land where there's some freshwater inputs from the local rivers. And then the Arctic icy waters are coming down counterclockwise in the bay from the north. And so these different factors mean that sea ice forms first, kind of in this area. And the bears tend to know that. And so even if they've been pretty well inland throughout the summer, especially moms and cubs will be kind of hunkering down inland, they will be starting to move toward the coast as temperatures fall and the days get shorter. They know that ice is coming. And really, as soon as we start seeing even a little bit of ice, because it's not always linear, it's not like all of a sudden everything freezes. We can kind of see it start in bits and pieces sometimes. The bears are testing that ice as soon as they can. Even when it's just starting to freeze, we see them go out there and see if their weight will be held, kind of pushing on it. We'll see them try to walk on pretty thin stuff, and they can be successful. It's pretty neat to watch. And then as soon as there's any decent ice, they're gone almost overnight. We can tell they're really these ice bears. I like to call them blubber hunting ice bears because they want to be out on that ice as soon as they can for the most part. And it's really there's an example there of a guy hanging out waiting for dinner to come up, waiting for a seal to come up to breathe. So yeah, for these polar bears, even though they can, spend good amounts of time on land, they really are so well adapted for a sea ice life and for hunting those seals.
And in contrast to polar bears, brown bear habitat includes really a wide diversity of environments. So they're not really tied to like making a living in any particular habitat. Katmai offers one example. Bears have access to abundant food there, such as salmon, but they also thrive among giant trees in temperate rainforests along the coast of British Columbia and Southeast Alaska. So you'll find them in a wide variety of different places. Brown bears are also found in much more open habitats like grasslands and tundra. Historically, brown bears were found throughout Western North America, from the Great Plains to the California coast, and from the Sierras of northern Mexico northward across the Rocky Mountains to the coastal plains along the Arctic Ocean in northern Alaska and the Yukon and Northwest Territories. Uh, the habitat preferences are, I think, one of the major differences
Mhm,
between the species that we're talking about today. Adaptations
mhm.
that brown and polar bears need to survive in different habitats are expressed in different ways too, Alysa. Some of it's physical. So I think some of it's behavioral, some of it's cultural. But maybe to start, let's talk about how they're different physically. We can look at those differences, visually. We can gain insight into why they live where they do. And to maybe help set up this part of the conversation, we have some side by side images of brown bears and polar bears that we can take a
Love
look
it.
at. Um, One of the things that I see, and I think maybe this illustration here is a good example, is the differences in facial structure between the two species. Brown bears seem to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, Alysa, but brown bears seem to have a much wider diversity in sort of like facial structure. Polar bears seem to
Mhm.
have that very sort of like conical face and muzzle. And I don't know if that's because they have to shove their faces sometimes in small holes to get at ice seals or not. But we're not necessarily seeing, that consistency in facial shape like we see in brown bears.
Yeah, I think you're right. We do tend to think that the the shape of the polar bear's head is excellent for getting in and out of seal holes. If you imagine a grizzly bear trying to do that, it's a bit like a square peg in a round hole. Polar bears have and also a bit of a longer neck, which can help them in and out of those holes. And also when they're swimming, sometimes they have to swim very long distances. So yeah, and I think they are a little more uh this similar in how they all look, which can be frustrating, I think, on the cams because we go from these brown bear cams where people are amazing at telling these bears apart. Like it just blows me away how the viewers can pick out which bear is which right away. And when then we go over to the polar bears and it can be harder. So this bear here, you can see the polar bear anyway, so it has a little scar on his face, and that would help us if they've got some unique scars. That's really helpful. But when they don't, it's really hard to track which bear you're seeing. Have I seen 3 bears today, or has it been the same bear circling me 3 times? It can be tricky unless there's some kinda unique things that stand out about the bear. So, yeah, that's definitely one difference.
And we have, I think, another image as well that'll show them more on their full body
Oh,
size
yeah.
here. And that we
Mhm.
can talk about body size in both of these species because there's like this almost endless debate about which is bigger, the brown bear or the polar bear. Uh, I'll throw out some stats about brown bears first. Because the largest male brown bears weigh more than 550 kilograms or 1,200 pounds, and the real giants among brown bears, like on Kodiak Island, and some of the biggest bears in Katmai can weigh more than 650 kilograms or 1,400 pounds. So some really big bears. And then
Mhm.
there's differences in their between males and females. So male brown
Mhm.
bears generally are maybe as much as 1.5 to 2 times bigger than females, and this is really related to diet. So if you are
Mm.
a bear living in a habitat like Katmai, we have access to a lot of meat, particularly salmon. You can grow bigger than if you're like a bear that's living largely on a vegetarian diet. And I think that's reflected as well in polar bears, Alysa. And polar bears, I think, might actually have an absolute larger body size compared to brown bears. I mean, brown bears are big, but polar bears can get
Hmm.
even bigger.
Yeah, I think it's exactly what you said. So there, if we looked at all brown bears and all polar bears now, sure, there would be a lot of brown bears that are bigger than a lot of polar bears, but their absolute achievable size, I do think polar bears have the edge. I believe that the heaviest polar bear ever weighed was 2,200 pounds, and that was in
Wow.
Alaska a couple decades ago. And that was, a really big, well-fed bear. Usually they
I'll
are
say.
more kind of in the range of what you were saying. 1,200 pounds would be a good size adult male sort of thing. And they are also quite dimorphic, with the males being twice the size of females. And a lot of that's due to breeding and mating, the males having to compete very aggressively for a female suitor. And for polar bears, I think they get the edge simply based on diet. So even your brown bears that are eating the really high calorie salmon, that's great for them, but they might also make their living having some, berries and vegetables other parts of the year. Whereas for polar bears, yeah, they'll eat some grass and whatnot, but really they have a blubber diet, and blubber is the most calorically dense food out there pretty much. And if you're gonna eat fat all day, you're gonna get pretty fat. So I think they get the edge. A well-fed polar bear is going to have the edge over a well-fed brown bear. We'll put it that way.
And I think it's hard for us to compare them on our webcams because we
Yeah.
see brown bears and katmai at their fattest point in the year. We generally don't see
Hmm.
that with polar bears. If we could see the polar bears like in May or something like that, we'd be like, oh, okay, they are
Right.
they are giants as well. Uh, and then I think one more, obvious outward physical difference between the two species is fur color. I mean, maybe that's the thing that stands out the most.
Mm,
And I think one of the main ideas in our program today is that polar bears are like the specialists of bears in North America, while brown bears are more
mhm.
generalists. And as we look closer at their physical behavioral adaptations, we'll find that pattern sort of repeats again and again. It's especially obvious in their fur. So when we look at brown bear fur, it's often plain brown, but it ranges in color from like blonde, as you see here
Mhm.
with a bear that we know as grazer, to very dark
Mhm.
brown in other bears. And then there's can be patterns in the fur color. For example, the fur of male brown bears tends to be darker than female brown bears. That's not an absolute rule. There's definitely some pretty darkly furred female brown bears out there, but on average, it seems like males have darker fur. And then their fur provides camouflage and insulation and some protection from biting insects, but it's really not specialized for their habitats. And that's a
Mm.
big difference, Alysa, with polar bear fur. It is uh, a specialization for where they are living and how they make a living.
Absolutely. Yeah. So when they split from brown bears many tens of thousands of years ago, they would have taken that gene, the lighter gene, and used that to help them camouflage on the sea ice. So that white fur has helped them kind of blend into the ice, sneak up on seals more easily. So that's one advantage. Their fur is also hollow, largely hollow. And we think that that helps trap warm air against their bodies. And I will say too, so we just started there's a group out of the University of Tennessee who has a multi-year grant, and we're just going to be working with them on the education side. So when there's more to share, we will share it. But they're doing a deep dive into polar bear hair genetics and comparing them to brown bears. I'm like, what
Oh, neat.
happened here that you split? And like, how did this work? Because I don't know if you know more about this, Mike, but I guess some brown bears do have hollowish fur. There is a difference amongst brown bears with how their fur is expressed, and polar bears definitely split off from somewhere in those genes, and we're really excited to learn more about this in the next couple of years, like what's going on here. But you're absolutely right, polar bears have very special fur. And I am it's not actually white, I should mention that too. I'm sure many viewers know it just looks white to us. You can see these bears are kind of like creamy butter bears in the snow. So
Mhm.
especially after a long kind of summer on land, they do get almost a little bit greasy. We know that their fur has a special grease that's quite similar to what you would put on skis. And that helps prevent icing on the fur, but it can also make them look a bit yellowed over time. And then in the spring, and after they get some nice swims, nice ice baths, and they do a bit of molting in the spring, they can look much whiter. So their fur definitely picks up colors in the air as well because it is hollow and clear. And I call them sunset bears sometimes when you can see them on the cams when the sun's setting and the sky's like beautiful and pink and orange. The bears kind of look pink and orange as well. So their fur really is quite special, and has a lot of stuff to talk about with it, I guess. Yeah, I love it.
We also have, of course, have to talk about their diets as well and how
Oh
they're
yeah.
similar and different. And maybe to start, I'll set up with us up with an idea about how they're classified by scientists. So they're all bears are classified in the taxonomic order Carnivora. So that's a group of mammals that
Mhm.
includes canines, felines, raccoons, seals, weasels, and a few other families. And it seems to make intuitive sense, to place bears in that group, right? Because they have big teeth. They like to eat a lot of meat. Except if you're a giant panda, that's they're they're a bear, but they're sort of like a different bear in their own way, very much so. So yeah, bears will eat a lot of meat when given the chance, but the classification of a carnivore isn't based on diet. It's really kind of like their shared evolutionary history. They have a shared common ancestor. So just because they belong to that group of animals as a carnivore doesn't mean they got to eat like a carnivore. And that's really a big difference, I think, between brown and polar bears, because brown bears live as a generalist omnivore. They're like humans in that sense. They'll eat and survive on a great diversity of foods. In fact, most brown bears in North America, in Asia, and Europe are largely vegetarian. In the northern Rocky Mountains, there have been studies that have found that the yearly diet of many grizzly bears is more than 90% plants. And then Katmai's bears, they're going to be a bit of an exception because they have access to a lot of meat, particularly salmon. But they don't shun plants. They eat a lot of grass, a lot of sedge, herbaceous plants, and berries when they have that opportunity. But salmon certainly are very important for them. And then bears are brown bears especially are adapted to survive on rough foods better, so foliage better than other carnivores. They don't have a multi-chambered stomach or anything like that, but they do have a slightly longer digestive tract compared to like a more pure carnivore like a lynx, for example. And then their dietary flexibility is also one way that their adaptations give them the opportunity to live in so many different places. But a diet composed of plants, it has consequences for them. They can't survive solely on green vegetation. They just don't have the digestive tract for it. So they can't get fat solely on greens alone. So they got to look for other foods. And Alysa, the diet of polar bears is I think one of the best examples of specialization that differentiates them from brown bears.
Right. I think it's really the key to all of it. When polar bears split off to go hunt seals and they became used to or needed this high fat diet all of a sudden. So, as you mentioned, they are carnivores, and polar bears are often called the most carnivorous of all the bears, which is true. But we like to even take it a step further and call them lipovores or fat eaters, because really it is for them, it's all about the blubber and their digestive system has also adapted to handle huge amounts of blubber and calories. You can see this bear here. This is what they'll do sometimes if there's a lot of seals to eat. It's the spring and there's plenty of food to go around. They'll even just strip the blubber off a seal and won't even eat the meat. They'll leave it behind for scavengers if they've got enough food. So we know if polar bears eat too much protein, we know this from zoo studies, their kidneys actually will be harmed. So they really do need this high fat diet. And in their digestive system, they have, my understanding is at least 8 differences compared to brown bears that helps them digest fat and use it. And well over 90% of the blubber they eat goes directly onto their body in the form of fat. So imagine that conversion rate for humans. I mean, that would be terrifying. But for polar bears, it's highly efficient and highly necessary. If you're going to be a big bear that lives on the frozen ocean in the Arctic, like that's ridiculous. You need to be able to gain a lot of weight when you need to and eat that blubber, and of course like have the teeth, have the structure, and have that way to eat. And they also, I know for brown bears, when they're in that kind of hyperphagia period and they're eating a ton of salmon, maybe you can tell me how much they'll eat in a day, but polar bears will eat over 100 pounds of blubber in one sitting when they can. I mean, they're just the kings of feasting and fasting. I think these bears are amazing.
Yeah. A big bear in Katmai can throw back 100 pounds of salmon in a day
Okay.
pretty easily. So
Wild.
yeah, so I mean the
Yeah.
capacity of their stomach is just crazy. And I
It
I, I
is.
think the ancestral preference for fat
Mm,
that polar bears have, like that's expressed by brown bears. And we can see that as they catch and eat salmon in Brooks River, because each bite that a bear takes is a choice. Like it catches a salmon, it's like, okay, how am I going to tackle this fish right now? I could eat the whole thing, but often I'm gonna eat this part and that part and that part and discard some of this rest. So they often choose to eat the fattiest parts of the fish whenever possible. So on days when the bears are well fed, they eat the skin, the brain, the eggs of the salmon, and they're going to discard sort of like the fillets that we would prefer to put on our plates typically. This is a behavior we call high grading, and it allows bears to prioritize the types of calories they consume. So fat calories are extraordinarily valuable in the efforts to get fat before winter hibernation. So yeah, I think we see that those commonalities, and we can see sort of like how polar bears have taken that to an extreme in a sense. So really fascinating to think about. We did have an audience question, Alysa. Bears, when it comes to like, what they're going to eat when they're hungry, often they're not that picky, including other bears. And sometimes people are wondering about this. So Michael Brannigan wrote in and was wondering, will a polar bear eat another polar bear if it comes across a dead polar bear? We know this happens with brown bears. Cannibalism is a thing in brown bears. And Michael's wondering the same about polar bears.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we've even seen this on the cams in Churchill years ago. Sometimes it is often the males either going after and killing a smaller younger bear, or if they do just come across a dead bear, they absolutely will eat each other if they're hungry enough. It happens.
Yeah, and thanks for all the questions so far, everybody. We have
Yeah.
a bunch that we're going to try to answer, and maybe one more quick one that we could get to quickly here. Alysa, talking about body size, and we talked about their absolute body size before. We didn't necessarily get into the dimensions, though, like how tall they
Mm.
might get.
Oh
And
gosh.
T Heck wrote in was wondering when standing on hind legs, how tall typically are polar and brown bears? I know the tallest brown bears can be like 8 to 9 feet tall when they're standing on their hind legs. Polar bears, I think, may exceed that. It's kind of crazy when you see them next to the Tundra buggy, and I always
Oh.
kind of wince. I'm like, people, stand back from the window, please.
Right. We do have to tell people like they can if they get their claws up there if they had wanted to. So the exact number is evading me and I don't want to misspeak, but I do know we tell kids that they can stand on their hind legs and dunk a basketball without jumping. So the adult males are very long, standing on their hind legs, absolutely. So I think they might have a bit of an edge over the grizzly bears again there, but not, I mean, not a massive difference, but they're pretty darn long.
One of the things that we might not see on the cameras because they're inside the bear's mouths, the difference is in their teeth. We can see how this is, the specialization or generalization of the diets of these two species manifest in their tooth adaptations or how they're shaped. Because brown bears, they still have a largely you know carnivorous group of teeth. They do have slightly flattened molars, and I think that helps them, or at least the idea is that helps them to chew vegetation and other fibrous foods a bit more efficiently. They're not great at it, but they have a slight edge in that regard. But polar bear teeth, again, we're looking at a generalist versus a specialist. As polar bears are taking their tooth pattern to the extreme for bears.
Yeah, they've got pretty sharp molars for molars. Their mouth is very much made for shearing and cutting and ripping blubber. And one interesting thing I think too between the bears is that polar bears have slightly weaker jaws than brown bears. Still very strong, still bear jaws.
Hmm.
Don't want to get bit by a polar bear, but brown bears have a better chomp because they're doing more grinding and eating more roughage. And polar bears have a pretty squishy diet, so they don't have to bite quite as hard. But yeah, their skull morphology definitely for a highly carnivorous bear.
Then there are these behavioral patterns and adaptations for winter. Polar bears and brown bears, they're not doing the same thing in winter. So I think that's where some of the biggest differences between these two
Mm,
species manifest. For brown bears, winter is a season of famine. Their lifestyle works well when they can find food, but their preferred foods basically vanish in winter. So they're faced with the season of starvation. And to circumvent winter altogether, they work to eat a year's worth of food in about 6 months. A fat brown bear in October is a bear that's stored away about half a year's worth of food through body fat. And we're looking at the Fat Bear Week winner there, number 32 Chunk. We're looking at another really giant female bear here, number 901 from Brooks River. So these bears are really well prepared for winter hibernation. And when they're hibernating, they don't eat, they don't drink, they don't urinate, they don't defecate. They breathe only 2 to 3 times a minute. Their heart rate declines to about 8 to 10 beats a minute. Their body temperature drops about 10 degrees Fahrenheit. And they can do this because they're surviving on fat. They burn body fat. They get the energy they need to stay warm, the metabolic water they need to stay hydrated. They also don't experience bone loss or muscle loss despite a complete lack of exercise. And that amount of continuous bed rest in a person would be terrible for our health. Brown bears get through it, just fine. They can even heal wounds while they're hibernating. On top of all that, mother brown bears give birth to cubs in midwinter, right around the end of January or early February. And then after the cubs are born, they'll suckle on mother's milk for several weeks in the den before the family leaves in the spring. So body fat really is essential for mother bears or brown bears to be able to successfully reproduce. And Alysa, the patterns of denning between these species really does offer significant contrast because in any given year, most polar bears do not enter a den. That behavior, however, still exists in a very important subset of polar bears.
Yeah, exactly. So in polar bears, it's only the mothers giving birth and going into the den pregnant, giving birth over the winter, and then coming out. Those are the only bears that head into the den and enter kind of any form of hibernation. Here we have the emergence. So this mom has been in a den all winter. She's given birth and hung out with her cubs for a couple months until they grow. These cubs grow really fast because polar bears have the fattiest milk we find on land, and that helps those cubs grow big and fast. And this mom has triplets. This is over in Svalbard as part of our maternal denning program. You can see there's a cub on her back right now, and she's gonna shake it off. That's pretty great footage. But yeah, polar bears, they've even been studied for by NASA for astronauts. Like how do bears prevent insane muscle loss from these periods of like not doing anything? Why aren't their muscles atrophying at faster rates, sort of thing? They're so fascinating to think about these hibernation events. But for polar bears, the other polar bears that are not pregnant moms, we used to think, like for example, the adult males that are on land around Hudson Bay all summer, we thought, well, surely they must go through some sort of energy slowdown or something to protect their bodies. And we used to call it walking hibernation. But years ago, some really cool energetics work looked at that in a deep dive, and they don't actually have any sort of protective metabolic changes in the summer. They are just functioning as normal. And in fact, polar bears ended up having higher energetic needs than we even estimated. So that's why on the polar bear cams, you see a lot of very lazy bears a lot of the time. Again, when it cools down, they perk up and you might see some more action, but a lot of the time, they're walking pretty slow. They're sleeping a lot, taking a lot of polar bear naps because they really have to protect their energy and their body fat. They've reached their peak. The polar bear's peak weight is in the spring when the seals are pupping. There's a lot of easy food. They're gorging as much as they can. We've actually talked about this before. Fat bear for brown bears is so great because you watch bears eat fish. I don't know if even as it would make us happy to watch polar bears gain weight eating seals, I don't know if people would really want to watch that often. Here's one
Right.
clean example, no blood, of a polar bear hunting a seal. And this is rare footage to get. This is also up in Svalbard. This polar bear uses the sea ice to sneak up on its prey, grabs a seal, and takes off with dinner. I don't know if people have the stomach to watch polar bears killing baby seals all day, so I don't think that can will be possible. But that is when they're getting nice and big and fat. Then they're making it through the summer, and then in the fall, the moms will go into the dens, and even the bears that then have the ice to head out on, they're hunting as much as they can, but it's not like there's a ton of food necessarily right away. It's really kind of that spring season, and like you said, you eat a year's worth of calories in a short window of time, and bears are really good at doing that.
We had an audience question that leads into the next section of our program that we wanted to talk about. Tan Zamdo, sorry, Tazddo, wrote in and is wondering, do all bears hibernate? Alysa just mentioned how not all polar bears are hibernated. Then the polar bear moms can't exactly say that they're hibernating. They're going to then to give birth, and they do have a lot of adaptations that help them to survive that period and do so in a healthy manner. But it's not quite the same as like a hibernating brown bear. But interestingly, brown bears are not obligate hibernators. This means they don't have to hibernate to survive if the right conditions exist for them to stay active. So this is one of the similarities they continue to share with polar bears. So for example, brown bears are quite tolerant of cold. So hibernation, really, it's really not an adaptation for them to avoid cold weather as much as it is an effort for them to outwait famine. The catch for them in winter is that they can't find enough food to remain active. So they're just like, okay, I'll cut my losses. I'll go into a den. I'll sleep it off. I'll come back out when conditions are better. I If they can, though, they can remain active. And biologists have documented winter active brown bears in many places, especially like on Kodiak Island, which is south of Katmai or east of Katmai, and it's out in the Pacific Ocean, has a much bit more or a more mild climate. So there can be a few winter active bears there every year. And I think that the denning behaviors and physiologies of brown and polar bears are really kind of a good example of these inherited traits being leveraged by a species as it evolves and adapts. We'll talk about the evolution and genetic relatedness of brown bears in a few moments. There was a related question, Alysa, with with brown bears. We know that there's generally like a threshold of body fat that a female bear needs to successfully reproduce to give birth in the den, and that's right around 20% body fat when she begins denning. CY0967 wrote in and was wondering, does it depend on the amount of fat for a female polar bear has on whether they have babies in the den? Is it similar to female brown bears' reproductive systems?
Yeah, I think it is absolutely similar. So polar bears have what we call delayed implantation. So they'll mate on the ice in the spring. They'll come ashore, well, at least in Hudson Bay, come ashore in the summer. And then in the fall, it is up to how healthy the mother's body is, whether those fertilized zygotes implant or not. If she's not healthy and fat enough, they'll flesh out. If she's big enough, she'll go into a den, they'll implant. And I don't know the exact percent body fat. I bet it's similar, but I know that the lowest weight female polar bear we know of that got pregnant was 420 pounds. That seems to be the lowest threshold, that they need to be at least 420 pounds, ideally heavier than that, before they can successfully give birth. And I wanted to mention too, living in Whitehorse in the Yukon, that's something people are talking more about here too for hibernation, is that when it kind of warms up a little bit more in the winter now than it used to, people are seeing bear tracks around. So
Mm.
now it's recommended in the winter, like, still take your bear spray with you. You might still bump into a bear even in the middle of winter. You just don't know. It's food dependent, like you mentioned, Mike. So yeah, these are great questions too. Thank you, everybody. Keep them coming.
Let's talk about what happens for a bear family after they leave the den.
Sure.
We actually had an audience question about this that came in before the program. Pat wrote in and was
Oh,
wondering,
great.
how long do polar bear cubs stay with their mother? So what's their family life
Mhm.
like after they're coming out of the den?
Yeah. So their first year of life, they're called Cubs of the Year, sometimes Coys for short. They're super dependent on mom. They're nursing a lot. In their second year of life, after they turn 1 year old, we call them yearlings. They'll still nurse a little bit, but now they're eating even more meat. They're hopefully helping mom out a little bit, but they're still highly dependent on her. When they turn 2 years old, we call them 2 year olds, and they'll stay with their mom until that spring. So they're with their mom about 2 1/3 years or so, maybe 2 1/4 years. Um, and at that point, mom, we think usually the trigger will be another male bear coming in. When mom enters estrus again, she'll start giving out a pheromone in her feet. So she'll get these stinky feet and leave footprints across the sea ice that will attract males. It's one way to find each other out there, I guess, whatever works. And
Hmm.
we think often it will be the presence of a male that might chase the cubs away, or maybe mom is like, okay, I've had enough. Head out on your own now. And it's something that's not been documented a lot in polar bears, because, of course, a lot of the polar bear's life is happening so far away from people in ridiculously dark and harsh environments. So we haven't seen much of it, but that's our understanding at the moment. And maybe the cubs or the offspring will hang out together for a while as they leave their mom. Not too sure what that looks like either. We still have lots to learn.
Yeah, we have, I think, a lot of room to learn about that
Hmm.
process in brown bears. as well. The age at which family separation occurs is roughly the same as it is in polar bears, but it varies between bear populations and between individual bears. But generally, a mom will keep her cubs for 2 to 3 summers, then the family dens again one more time in the winter, and then they separate in the spring during the
Mhm.
mating season. And I used to think that mother was like kind of like the deciding factor. Like she didn't want cubs around, and then she just kind of drives them away. And there's some truth to that, but it might not be the primary factor. And you mentioned that, Alysa, that we know for sure that family breakup occurs and coincides with the return of a mother's estrus cycle, so during the mating season. And then her change in hormones and pheromones really starts to attract the
Mm,
attention of male bears. So a male bear might start hanging around mom. The kids decide they're uncomfortable with the situation, and they might decide to leave, I think, at that time. And I don't want to anthropomorphize their feelings here. It's probably not at all
mhm.
like situations in which a human teenager doesn't want to know what their parents are up to, right? Instead, I think it's the soon-to-be subadult bears. They're just kind of like uncomfortable because hey, there's this big guy. He's tailing
Oh
mom,
yeah,
and mom's like not really concerned like she would have been, last year. So
right.
the kid's reason he's big, he's a potential threat. Maybe it's time to start a new chapter in life. And this is something that scientists have described as male mediated breakup. So yeah, it's
Mm,
interesting to think about how those things are very, very similar between polar bears and brown bears. So they share these traits, physical traits, behavioral adaptations, but we can also observe differences in those adaptations and behaviors, and many of those things are behavioral adaptations about how they make a living and how those things are even passed down from mother to cub. So this creates and maintains culture among populations of bears. And this is one of the things that I find very fun to think about. Like in culture in human societies, culture in bears, it's like socially transmitted. It is their collection of learned customs and traditions. And just as each individual bear is unique, every bear population has its own sort of special culture that showcases the
mhm.
adaptability and intelligence of those groups of bears. And I want to hear about that about polar bears, Alysa. But I was thinking today, like, hey, how can I describe like brown bear culture in Katmai? I think that's like a special food culture. It's learned over time to rely on salmon and engage in frequent social interactions. Because the bears at Brooks
Mm,
River, they encounter other bears daily during the salmon fishing season. For these bears, it's almost like living in a big city. You're just going to be around other bears a lot, so you gotta put up with it. You're going to have to figure out a way to deal with it. And this differs from bear cultures elsewhere that are less reliant on salmon, maybe where food sources are more dispersed. But bears possess a powerful sense of smell, so they know where their neighbors are, or at least where their neighbors were. I think that's they don't know all the time exactly where they are, but they know where they were. Uh, and places like Brooks River are super rare, so it's kind of more the opposite for most brown bear populations in
mhm.
in North America. And Lisa, with polar bears, um, they have this specialized, more carnivorous diet than brown bears. Yet I suspect that each population may have its own sort of foraging culture, or at least a culture that's associated with finding food in certain areas at certain times of the year.
Yeah, I think so in a way. Polar bears, they're not territorial, so they really spread out when they're out on the sea ice. But I think there are definitely pockets we can say are unique. I do think Churchill is its own thing. I mean, Churchill's one of the only places this guy's doing the starfish. I love it when they do this, when they're testing the thin ice. But Churchill's one of the only places in the world where we see sparring. So the males play fighting together in the fall, where there's no stakes, there's no food, there's no females, but they're playing together, and that's very cool. I would say that's part of the Churchill bear culture. There's also, I would look at Svalbard. Svalbard's an interesting example in the Beaufort Sea. There's, roughly 3,000 bears in that entire population. Most of those bears are what we call pelagic bears. They follow the sea ice out all year long. They're out on the sea ice back and forth with it. They might have to do big swims. They stay out there. But there's a few hundred bears, maybe about 300, called the local bears. And those bears have chosen to stay right on the island of Svalbard, Spitsbergen, and they hang out close to land, on land all year long, and
Hmm.
they don't do the big travels. And so we see the split even within a population of yeah, different strategies to make a living. And it is interesting. So yeah, we can look around the world, and I think Churchill, because it's the most famous spot for polar bears, people kind of think that it must be like that everywhere. And it's not necessarily. We do see some differences in how they travel and relate to each other and congregate. Yeah, it's an interesting point. I like bear culture.
And I see that as an example of like of bears having intelligence for their habitats. It's a
Mhm.
trait, that both of these species share, and it's probably common to virtually every organism. Whether they have like a a sensory apparatus like we do, or a centralized sort of nervous system like we do or not.
Mhm.
um, they have animals have an intelligence for their habitats, but it's really kind of maybe obvious to see in bears. These bears also share a close evolutionary history. We've touched on that a few times during the program so far. It was something that we're asked about frequently. So Alysa, can you talk about how closely related brown and polar bears are?
Right. They're pretty closely related. Yeah, they are close cousins. The polar bears split off from the brown bears, probably in the Alaska area. I don't know, you're probably more read up on it than I am, Mike, but hundreds of thousands of years ago, but still close enough to mate. So we think that these bears have always kind of interbred to some extent, occasionally in certain pockets. But it just goes to show you how close they still are. They have very different strategies. They look different, but they are very closely related as far as bears go.
And one of the other questions is, can brown and polar bears hybridize? In fact, we kind of have a related question to this that came in. Rose's fall thorns remain asked, do polar and brown bears cross paths? How will they interact? If so, it really
Mm,
depends. I think it depends on whether there's a food source around. It
hmm.
depends on their hunger levels overall. Depends on the individuality of the bear too. Some bears are just more ornery than others. Some are more kind
Hmm.
of kind of laid back and easygoing. So there's a bunch of different ways that those things can or that the bears can interact. I've heard anecdotally that like at a whale carcass, for instance, maybe on like the north slope of Alaska, that brown bears can be a bit more dominant. Maybe just they're just more aggressive in that situation. I don't really know for sure, but the
Hmm.
hybridization thing is something that people are always wondering about and kind of and very interested in. And polar bears and brown bears can hybridize. That's how close in relation they actually are. And with climate change, people are wondering, is that going to happen more often? There is recent evidence of it happening, Alysa, but it seems to be fairly isolated overall.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think you put together a wonderful graphic there, Mike. And I'll say, well, yeah, actually, first let's talk through this graphic. Thank you for
Yeah.
doing this. So yeah, there was a lot of buzz when this story kind of came out. Oh, it was over a decade ago now. Um, but once the genetics were completed on all these bears, it told a pretty interesting story that there's one female polar bear up in the high Arctic of Canada, and in her lifetime, she mated with two different brown bear males. Now, we're not sure if she had other options and she chose these guys or if these were the only options she had. Not, we'll never know. But those were her choices. And with both different males, she had cubs. And one of those cubs, those 50-50 hybrids, did go on to mate. So sometimes hybrids are sterile, but this hybrid was fertile, which was pretty cool. And she mated with one of those brown bear males and had her own cub and her cubs. So pretty interesting, but pretty isolated. And also anecdotally, important to say this, it seems like these offspring, these hybrid mixes, did not make for a very happy bear. So if we think of how specialized polar bears are and how generalized brown bears are, if you kind of find the middle of that, where does that bear belong? So these bears
Hmm.
were raised by, or the original litter raised by polar bear moms, but from what we heard, they then went back to land when they were weaned and tried to live on land. They kind of had a creamy coat, kind of light, maybe blonde, a little blonder than a blonde brown bear, but kind of creamier than a regular polar bear. Dark circles around their eyes, feet that were kind of halfway between a brown bear and a polar bear. And very anecdotally, we heard stories that they were quite aggressive, and that could be because they were having trouble finding food. Who knows what was going on with their digestive system or teeth? I don't know. But we heard from people that live in the north that like this bear was more aggressive than usual, and there were some interesting stories from people that live up there with these bears. So yeah, quite interesting. I'm sure we will see hybrids again or a hybrid again somewhere, absolutely. this will not be a new bear species that will take over. We get kids asking that sometimes, like, "Oh, it'll be a whole new bear," and I don't think this bear will be very successful in the future or at any time.
Yeah, I think that's one of the important points to consider. It's not
Mhm.
like there's going to it doesn't seem like there's really any evidence that suggests there's going to be some sort of radiating event where like, okay, all of a sudden we have this like cross of a bear that's going to do just fine in the
Yeah,
wake of climate change.
yeah,
Probably not.
solved.
Yeah, and there's even evidence from the end of the last ice age where there were populations of brown and polar bears that intermixed, and they didn't create some sort of weird hybrid. It's sort of like eventually
Mhm,
those polar bear genes were just kind of washed out of the population by incoming brown bears. So that's maybe what would happen,
mhm,
in a lot of these places if polar bears happen to be stuck on land without access to sea ice. So we're working towards the opposite of that. We want bears out on the sea ice,
mhm,
of course, um, to be able to make a living like they've evolved to do. And as we head towards the end of our program, Alysa, I do want to talk about bear conservation because as
mhm.
human activities such as burning fossil fuels, is forcing the climate to warm, and the more we actively alter habitats where bears live, bears are going to be challenged to further, survive. And because of their generalist lifestyle, brown bears are pretty well
Mhm.
adapted to endure changes in their habitats, but they need the space to be able to do that, right? And that's
Yeah.
extremely important. They live within a world of limitations. When food is scarce or competition is high among brown bears, the stress it's really going to manifest first and most acutely among reproductive females. And at least I think that's what we're witnessing among polar bears of Western Hudson Bay. That brown bears can live in so many different habitats, but polar bears are really specialized. And it's not the adult males of the polar bears that are going to be the ones most challenged by like climate change and reduced sea ice. It's really going to be the reproducing females.
Exactly. And when we talk about losing Arctic sea ice habitat and polar bears losing access to food, I think sometimes people imagine the resulting population declines as like, oh, there's going to be these starving polar bears everywhere. And there can be starving polar bears in little pockets, but that's really not what we're seeing broadly or what the mechanism of population decline mainly is, how we're talking about it. It is the pressure on these moms and cubs. It's harder to get pregnant, harder to stay pregnant, harder to raise these cubs up, and harder for the cubs when they're first weaned as subadults to make it into adulthood in this kind of more unpredictable world where they're coming into more contact with people and have to figure out a lot of things, how to get food. So you're right. It's the moms. The moms matter big time for these populations.
And we know that brown bears aren't immune to the effects of habitat loss and climate
Hmm.
change. Polar bears are especially sensitive to those changes. The loss of sea ice increases risks for polar bears, but and it also increases risks for people as well that are living in these northern communities where polar bears are being forced to spend more time on land. Churchill, Manitoba, Alysa, really does model sort of like a bear safe community. Can you discuss sort of like their commitment needed for that effort to be successful?
Right. Churchill is often called the polar bear capital of the world. We've been fortunate to sit on the Churchill Bear Smart Working Group for the last several years. That's working to make Churchill the first polar bear safe community. And it takes all levels. It takes local people, different stakeholders. There's tourism operators, government officials at different levels working together to best manage polar bears and people. More and more, it comes down to the people practices. So something we do, for example, is provide safety education for visitors to Churchill. We provide tools, safety tools where we can, like bangers and bear spray. A big thing for all bears is waste management, of course. And Churchill had a wonderful indoor garbage dump that burned down last year. It currently has an outdoor dump. We've helped get an electric fence around it, but it is an ongoing challenge bringing polar bears over to the dump. It is outside of town, luckily, but locking up garbage is one of the best things we can do for bears. I was very fortunate also to be at the International Human Bear Conflict Workshop last week. It was fascinating, a whole week of bear talks and about bears living with people. And I just wanted to mention a couple things. First, that it's human bear conflict. To put the human first is very intentional because almost always it's the humans that have the influence on the bears. The bears are just hungry, doing what bears do. And then another thing I really liked about the conference is that there's no such thing as a problem bear. So that used to be something we would say, oh, that's a problem bear. We got to remove it. The bear's just being a bear. It's not a problem. So if anyone said the word problem bear, they'd get an air horn. And it was just a good reminder that there's other ways we can phrase or frame these conversations to remember, oh, yeah, the bears are just doing bear things. We can do better for the bears and help keep them in the population, particularly for polar bears as they're losing their regular habitat, their sea ice habitat. They're on land more, they're hungrier. They will be coming into communities. How can we support people and support the bears at the same time?
And there's a similar situation that exists at Brooks Camp in Katmai. That's a place where dozens of brown bears, of course, gather every summer for salmon. Thousands of people come to visit. And the public facilities there are located in near perfect bear habitat. And I know we don't have a lot of time left in our program, but I did want to show like a few photographs from Brooks Camp. This is an aerial photo of like the Brooks Lodge area. The visitor center is tucked in there as well. A bunch of park housing and things like that. You can see sort of like those radial patterns of trails at the right side of the image, kind of heading out into a marsh. That's an old oxbow of Brooks River. Look to the left of that, sort of towards the bottom center of the frame. That honeycomb pattern, those are all bear trails. The ones that go out in sort of the marsh, the bears use those trails as well, but also a lot of anglers will go out there as they're looking to fish for trout in the river or whatever. But Brooks Camp is just like in the perfect spot that bears want to be. So it invites conflict between bears and people. But as you were saying, Alysa, the majority of the effort to manage bears is really people management. And at Brooks Camp, that means very careful and strict regulations about food storage, about gear storage. These measures are ultimately designed to protect bears from people. So we don't want to tempt them. But there's going to be some level of conflict between bears and people. Rangers in at Brooks Camp interact with bears to ensure that the boundaries are established between places where people reside and bears are discouraged from going. So I think anyone living in bear country, which is much of North America, can kind of take lessons from Brooks Camp and Churchill. Start by understanding the motivations of bears. They're curious, they're hungry. Don't tempt them. Don't give them that opportunity. Just take measures to protect your property from them by making sure that bears don't really have the motivation to come into your yard, for instance. You can work as a community to establish a bear-safe culture among your neighbors. We've talked a lot about the adaptations of bears during the program, but let's not lose sight of our ability to adapt so bears and people can coexist. So with that rant being done that I had there, at least one last question for you. I know we're just about out of time. Unfortunately, we had a lot of great audience questions we didn't get to. We never have enough time to answer them all. You'll blame that on me. But I'm wondering, Alysa, what can we expect to see on the polar bear cams in Buggy 1 this year?
Right. There'll be lots of more opportunities to ask questions about the polar bears anyway. So starting next week, we're kicking off a schedule running for 4 weeks. We've got live chats every week, webcasts every week. Tune in to any of them. We've got different topics. One really exciting thing is that we are getting a new Tundra Buggy One EV this year, an electric Tundra Buggy One. There's much more to come on that. We're very excited to have that new mobile broadcasting studio. And of course, you'll see polar bears. So in the coming weeks, as it cools down, we'll see more and more polar bears coming in. Keep an eye out on the polar bear cams. Most of them are up and running. At least one more to come very shortly. We're going to see moms and cubs. We will see sparring. Check out other wildlife that comes through and let us know what you're finding out. And we're just really excited to have another great season.
I am as well. The brown bears and polar bears, they're two closely related species. They have specialized adaptations to survive in different environments, but their lifestyles, again, they have, there's questions surrounding them in the era of human-driven climate change. These bears, we both know they're driven by profound hunger, right? They need body fat to survive. They need body fat to successfully reproduce. They're intelligent, they're individualistic, they're tough. They're resilient, they're adaptable, they're curious. We can say a lot of different things about them, yet they're very much unique in their own ways. And by working to tackle climate change, protect their vital habitats, we can help ensure that they are part of a present and future world. And I think that's a world worth working for. Alysa, I want to thank you for taking the time out of your day to join me. It's always fun talking with you, and have a fun polar bear season.
Yeah, thanks so much, Mike. We'll maybe see you out there on the tundra. Thanks, everyone.
Sounds great. And if you want to learn more, of course, go to explode.org bears to watch our brown bear cams. Go to explode.org/polar bears to watch the polar bear cams. And if you want to learn more about polar bears and Polar Bears International, go to their website. A lot of great information on there. polarbearsinternational.org. My name is Mike Fitz with explode.org. My co-host today has been Alysa McCall with Polar Bears International. Have a great day, everybody. And until we talk to you again, enjoy the bears.